What is up, guys? Welcome to the channel, and I hope you're being safe and healthy out there. Today I want to talk about one of the biggest misconceptions or misunderstood mechanics in all of World of Warcraft Classic, and that's genuinely something that's not said lightly. It is not so easy to understand, and we're going to go over that and why that is. But if you ever notice when you're fully world buffed or you're in the raid and all of a sudden some of your biggest buffs just disappear out of nowhere, well, today we're going to go over exactly why that happens, and we're going to go over as much as we can about understanding world buffs. A new hotfix goes live literally today, making things actually a little bit better for all of you guys out there that love to stack world buffs and consumes. My name is Sarth, welcome to the channel, and let's get right into it. So to understand world buffs, you need to understand auras, and I'm going to read straight off of a blue post of exactly what auras are. Auras are the system that tracks persistent effects on your character, such as changes to their stats, health, critical strike chance, etc. Auras are divided into three categories: helpful, harmful, and passive. Harmful auras refers to the 16 debuff slots on a boss or a mob, and helpful auras more commonly refer to the 32 buff slots that each character has. These are things that range from the obvious ones like Fortitude or Mark and Gift of the Wild, Arcane Intellect, Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer, your War Chief's Blessing, all three of your Dire Maul buffs, Songflower, the new Zandalari buffs. All of those take up individual buff slots. The next things that are going to take up most of your buff slots, that should be pretty obvious as well, are going to be your consumables. Basically, this is anything from, if you're using a flask, the new potions from ZG. This also refers to things like Elixir of Mongoose or Elixir of Arcane Power. All of your consumables are going to take up another buff slot, and you only have 32 of them, which sounds like a lot, and even Blizzard actually admitted they never expected people to be reaching this buff cap. But it is a limit that's actually pretty easy to hit if you're going for min-maxing and being fully raid buffed and consumed. Now, the main reasons you can actually hit these buff slot limit and start losing out on a lot of your main and important buffs isn't usually from some of the usual passive buffs that you're going to have on your character. It's not going to be from your consumables usually, and it's not going to be from your normal buffs. And that's what we're going to get into in a second. Now, this newer blue post talking about a hotfix that should go live today is referring to some of the hidden buffs and hidden auras that count towards your buff slot limit. The ones that are getting hotfixed specifically are going to be your enchants that are passive enchants. So let me read just directly from here. We noticed that our first round of enchantment fixes to prevent enchantments from consuming buff slots missed some of the enchantments that could be flagged to avoid consuming buffs. The powerful ZG enchants and the Arcanum enchants are among these. And we have a hotfix coming to make sure that they don't take up another buff slot. The big thing here usually is for tanks or DPS warriors possibly as well, because if they had enchanted 8 strength to their helm and legs, these actual enchant slots would take up entire debuff slots. One of the first things to understand about buffs is that the oldest buff gets pushed off first. So if you renew that buff, it'll just be pushed back in the line in the priority. I downloaded a specific weak aura for the purposes of today's video just to show you exactly how many buffs I have. The weak aura was actually updated today to show you that the helm and leg enchants, and I do have the ZG ones, but even the newer ones will not be taking up a buff slot once the patch goes live today. Now, it'll also tell me which buff is going to be the next one to be pushed off if I hit the buff limit. So the next buff that would be pushed off would be Arcane Intellect, because that was the first one that was put on myself. And I can just renew Arcane Intellect. You'll see that it changed to Ice Armor would be the next one to be pushed off, and then it's going to change to Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer. It's red because you obviously don't want that to get pushed off. Here I'm going to open up the patch notes so that you guys can see some of the confirmed behaviors that people have tested, and this is basically to go over the hidden buffs, the weird things that you wouldn't anticipate. There are weak auras and add-ons that will actually auto-detect and remove certain buffs if they're put on you. Things like Renew or any sort of hot heal over time effect. Our tanks in my guild actually do have an add-on that will remove all hots, but our healers are also told, please don't hot the tanks. It just takes up a buff slot, and it actually can take up 2 buff slots if another person were to put the exact same buff on the tank. As it's putting the new renew up, technically for a half second or for a second, it's going to take up 2 buff slots. It won't show on your buff bar up top, but it will, and it'll still knock off people's buffs. Other things that you're going to want to take into account are things like elemental sharpening stones will count for your buff tracker. The other sharpening stones won't. Mithril spurs, thorium shield spikes, tracking, and warrior stances all count towards your buff tracker. So all of these things, literally warriors at all times already have 1 buff on themselves for doing nothing whatsoever. They did have more if they had their enchants, but that's been fixed. Scopes and weapon chains don't count, so you don't have to worry. And when you do relog, it would put enchants at the back of the line, and refreshing buffs also puts them at the back of the line. Before I pull up some of the other actual resources that I can go over things specifically with you guys, there are a lot of other minute details in this, and people seem to think of them as hidden buffs or ghost buffs, and that's like what I referenced with Renew putting 2 buffs on. It's like if you have improved Shadow Bolt, multiple warlocks in your raid, it'll actually take up 2 debuff slots as it renews a new one. It'll only show 1 debuff slot on the boss, but it'll actually instantly take up 2 debuff slots. So sometimes renewing a buff or a hot can actually take up 2 buff slots. Other things you're going to want to watch out for are eating. You'll see that gave me 5 buffs, and drinking, that gave me 6 buffs. If I was pushing my buff cap, these would have knocked out 2 of my important buffs. The next buff to lose would be Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer. I can also put up Frost Ward, that would give me another buff, and Dampen Magic, another buff, and then of course Mana Shield. 7 buffs there, and then eating and drinking, there's an easy 9 buffs. I'm not world buffed at all other than this one Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer that happened while we're recording, and I'm already at 9 buffs. I have no consumes, and I'm not like a tank, so I'm not popping all of the consumes in the world. But warriors have things a lot more aggressive than everybody else. Things like Flurry or Crusader or even Shield Block. All of them take up a buff slot. So as a warrior, you're actually a lot more worried than most of the other classes, and tanks are usually the ones that have to be extremely particular about which buffs they allow on themselves. Because if somebody like your healer accidentally decides to just put specific buffs on you, you're pretty much screwed. You'll lose out on the biggest buffs in the game. The power of world buffs is absolutely massive, so you want to make sure that you're not losing them. Before I get into things even further, I do want to quickly mention that I did recently go over a brand new world buffs guide from Phase 4 and beyond, pretty much the definitive world buffs guide for World of Warcraft Classic, so make sure to check it out in one of these corners. But as most people that follow this channel know, I do main a rogue, so I'm going to go over specifically buffs for rogues, and you can see things that apply to other classes as well. And in the resource I'm about to show you, I would actually disagree with a couple of the things that it tells you not to grab, because you do want to stack yourself still with world buffs as you're going around the world and getting other world buffs, because if you do get dispelled, you want to lose the ones you don't need first. And then when you get in the raid, you can feel free to click the ones you don't need off. Here's things that take up your buff slots, and it kind of goes through like rogue buffs. Is it a DPS increase? Should you use it? And what are the notes, basically? So let's just kind of look at this and go through it. Slice and Dice obviously takes 1 up. Adrenaline Rush takes 1 up. Blade Flurry takes 1 up. Offhand Poison takes 1 up. If you are Alliance, then that also is your main hand poison. That's 5 right there. Every time you pop Vanish, it actually pops 2 of your CDs. Wind Fury is going to take up the other one, and it might actually take up 2 buff slots, as a new ghost buff is actually applied whenever Wind Fury procs, so watch out for that one. Racials take up a slot. Will of the Forsaken will take up a slot. Blood Flurry, all of your racials are going to take up another slot. Consumables obviously do take up a slot. Dragon Breath Chili does have its merit. Things like Elixir of Fortitude, I don't think it's big enough to be useful taking up a debuff slot for anyone, even for most tanks, because they can just use the ZG pots now. 140 HP is not very much. All of your totem buffs count towards your buff cap. That also means all of your paladin buffs count toward your buff cap. And that is like auras and your blessings. All of them count toward your buff cap. If you're running Crusader on both of your weapons, that is another 2 buff slots you need to watch out for. This is another big thing for warriors to watch out, because that's 2 buff slots just taken out of nowhere. Obviously your evasion, sprint, but things people don't notice usually is first aid actually takes up a buff slot. Trinket procs take up buff slots, Noggin Fogger or Savory Deviant Delight takes up buff slots, and I like to be a ninja, so I usually use it because I'm not going for all of my other buff slots. And even mounting up takes up a buff slot. I was gonna log on my warrior and go fight some things, but he has world buffs for today's raid already, so I'm just gonna show you another spreadsheet specifically for warriors that is slightly outdated now, but it's from the Fight Club Discord. First is Battle Shout, and that's an obvious one. But your stance is taking up another one, is something I mentioned earlier. Flurry and Rage, Bloodthirst, Blood Rage, Berserker's Rage, Shield Block, Sweeping Strikes, Recklessness, Shield Wall, Retaliation, Last Stand, and Blood Craze. All of those things take up buff slots. So if you're a warrior, especially if you're the main tank and you are fully decked out in consumables and world buffs, and you're getting consistently healed, you're taking up multiple buff slots that you can be significantly below the buff cap. It can look like you're at 20 buffs, and you can actually start losing some of your important world buffs. You're gonna get power word shielded almost all the time, right before any Shadow Flame, and anytime you're taking a big hit like a Mortal Strike from Broodlord Lashslayer. So tanks have a lot more to watch out for with world buffs, but one of the most important ones for your tanks that people usually try to stay away from is specifically the HOTS. And that's specifically because, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes HOTS can actually account for 2 buff slots for a split second while they're proccing or renewing a new one. And there you have it, guys. That's pretty much a conversation to understand the buff limit and the 32 buff slots and why you might be losing some of your world buffs in a raid. Now, I know I didn't show specifically that happening to me or examples of it. I thought about using some other people's footage, but I didn't want to take any of their content. So I just chose to have more of a conversation with you guys, explaining buffs and explaining the buff cap. I would mention that speaking to a couple people that write a lot of Wowhead articles on these things, they do say that you should always be weary of buff cap trackers. They are usually reliable, but there are some things that could go up there, so you never really want to push the envelope on your buff cap limit. I will leave a link in the description to this buff cap weak aura here on the side of my screen, and actually I will also leave a link in the description to a buff cap tracker add-on, so you guys can grab that if you want it as well. It makes it easy for you to automatically dispel or remove any of the buffs that you don't want to have, and that's basically mostly HOTS for tanks. This information is mostly essential for tanks, but there's a lot of mystery about it out there in the world of World of Warcraft Classic, so I did want to make a video going over it. If you have any questions or if I missed something, because once again, that usually does happen, just leave it in the comments for me. I'll try to pin any comments that have a lot of useful information. If you enjoyed the content or you found this helpful at all, or even just like me as a person, please like and subscribe. I appreciate that so much. And of course, you guys can always check me out on Twitch, link right there and link in the description. And I will be back with at least another video every week. So if there's something you want to learn about or something you want to hear me discuss, just let me know also in the comments section. All right, guys, that's it for me. Have a good one out there. Congrats to Warriors. You guys are probably stoked that the helm and leg enchants no longer take up a buff slot. Let's get all that gear, stay safe, and I'll see you out there in the next one.